All right, here we are. Still in chapter 10, still talking about fitness evaluation, selection and administration. This is presentation number 5, the last one in the series. Administration and organization of fitness assessments and interpretation and review of results. So with test prep, they talk about making sure you have pre-assessment screening with your client, verify the assessments are appropriate for your client. You need to have the facilities to be able to evaluate your client. And then you have to verify that the equipment is in good functioning order. And then you have to instruct your client on protocols and prepare some kind of record keeping system. Now, granted, with the instruction regarding protocols, for some of your clients, they may be already familiar with like a seated chest press or dumbbell bench press or whatever exercise you're asking them to perform. And there's a little bit of erosion of validity at that point because the person actually has more familiarity with the actual test. But that's another story that we talked about in a previous presentation. In general, these are your big points that you're after, though, in terms of test prep. With implementation, you kind of have to have sequencing in mind, right? And have an understand of how you want your assessments to flow. And there's a logic to it depending upon general population or athletic population. You need to define and follow the test protocols. And if you have large populations, if you're in strength and conditioning and you have 350 athletes you're working with, whatever test you choose as your main assessments, the 4 or 5 exercises that you use for all your athletes, and then whatever specific for each sport, you need to have an understanding of how you want to implement those and be able to put them in the right sequential order in terms of what you want to do for your athletes. Now, granted, you're not going to test all 350 athletes at the same time. You have in-season, off-season, preseason for fall sports, winter sports, and spring sports. So, you have different testing windows throughout the year for each one of those different mesocycles. But it's an understanding of how you're going to actually put those testing protocols in place. So a few items to pay attention to. Let me get myself out of the way here. In the book, they talk about field tests, and field tests are very practical. They allow us to evaluate performance. They're inexpensive, they're easy to administer, they require less equipment, they're less time consuming, and can be performed in any number of different venues, and they could be more efficient, right? If you're talking about large groups. So, if you're trying to do something outside of a clinic or a laboratory environment, you would have more field type tests to evaluate your client base or your athletic population. And the other thing that the book points out that there's a takeaway here is that there should be adequate hydration. You're going to have these pre-assessment protocols. And of course, you want to guide your clients and athletes regarding how much they should eat beforehand and when. Did they get enough rest beforehand? How much? But the key takeaway that the book has here is they talk about having adequate hydration, and they really have that as a bullet point in the book as well as a quiz later on. I do make note of the sequencing, like I mentioned earlier, that you have general fitness and athletic performance populations. Hold on. Okay, here we go. So you have, for general fitness, they talk about resting tests, stuff like resting heart rate, blood pressure, height, weight, and body composition. And it makes sense. You're about ready to take your client through a battery of tests, and one of them might be some kind of run walk test or some kind of cardiovascular oriented test. And then you're going to try to do resting heart rate afterwards. It's nonsensical, right? So you have to think of this in terms of, okay, we're going to evaluate the body and the form of the person first. So we're going to do things like resting heart rate, blood pressure, height, weight, body composition. And then we get into like non-fatiguing tests, which will be more performance oriented. And then you get into muscle strength tests, like bench press, or something that's more cardiovascular oriented. So think of this in terms of you're evaluating the person, and then you're evaluating the performance of the person, if you will. That's kind of a way to wrap yourself around it. For athletics, you start off same thing with the resting test, and you go non-fatiguing. Then you go into agility test, power, sprint test, vocal muscle, and then anaerobic capacity test like a 300-yard shuttle. I will tell you, if you're testing out 150 different football players, you'll probably have like one big cattle call to do things like 40-yard dash, 300-yard shuttle. These are very kind of team-oriented moments that you could really capitalize on to to get people to get behind one another and motivate one another to be able to perform better. But I'll tell you, you have to be very good at mapping out the schedule over the course of probably a week to be able to do all your field tests outside, whether it's 40-yard dash, 5, 10, 5, perhaps it's 300-yard shuttle. And then you have things like power tests that you would do for broad jump or vertical jump. And then you'd have a lower body exercise like squats you're probably going to test on, and then an upper body like bench press you're going to test on. And you're probably also going to want to find out about their power clean. So now I have to throw this back to you, my students. Think about how you'd actually map that out over the course of a week. So you're not doing all these tests on one day. When you start talking like quite literally wholesale testing or evaluation of an entire team, you have to be kind of systematic in how you map out your testing. And usually you do the more, like if they show here, shorter burst, more agility type work on the front end. And then you kind of think of this in terms of walking across the continuum of short explosive and the phosphagen system across all the way over more into that more lactic acid, as you like to say, system, where it's more like the anaerobic capacity tests. But in general, that's kind of how you map it out. And then you have to just kind of think through how you're going to map out power cleans on one day, squats on the next day, or bench on the next, or perhaps power cleans, which is what I would do, on day one, upper body strength on Wednesday, and then squats on Friday, because power cleans, total body exercise. Then you go upper body, let your lower body recover, and then they can have a better performance on the squats. Or if you really want to focus on the squats, you put those on Monday before you do all your other field testing. And it depends on what you're trying to accomplish as a coach. So with this, they give you some general indications for stopping an exercise test, onset of angina or angina-like symptoms, meaning like pain in the chest. Drop a systolic, you have systolic over diastolic. So if you have a drop of systolic blood pressure of 10 millimeters mercury or with an increased workload, or if systolic blood pressure decreases below the value obtained in the same position prior to testing, those are reasons to stop. And you can kind of read through the rest of these. But you'll understand that when you have people test and you have people come in to perform tests, especially in the athletic realm, usually there's a little bit of test anxiety that happens, and people will have probably some elevated heart rate and blood pressure readings just because there's some anxiety regarding the testing, or perhaps they're just jacked up on pre-workout to be able to perform better on the test. So you're going to have some results that might be skewed a little bit. But this is a pretty good list here to just kind of keep in mind regarding reasons for stopping an exercise test. Interpretation and review of results. They talk about these two things, norm reference and criterion reference. If you have norm reference, these you take the results and you compare them against others in a similar category. So now if I use my example of we do performance testing and we do vertical jump, 40-yard dash, and we do 5, 10, 5 shuttle, and we do it across the entire football team, we can further subcategorize that into offensive linemen, defensive backs, running backs. You can compare your athletes to one another to see how they perform as a group against one another. Criterion reference standards, put your fingers in quotes here and say it's used to compare against a health standard. And the health standard, might be from research data that's presented to give norms for a Rockport walking test or another type of fitness test. And you look at these specific criteria and reference standards, not as a comparison against others per se, like in a competitive group, but it's against a standard that's been developed from data that's been received. I will say this, that data had to come from somewhere, and the data came from testing results of other people. So in essence, you're kind of comparing yourself to the norms of other people. Just saying. But that's the big difference between norm reference and criterion reference standards. All right, guys, signing off, and we'll move on to chapter 11. Thanks.